Awesome. And we'll kick it off. My name's Shannon Regan. I'm the education coordinator for the Friends of GNFAC. Thanks for tuning in to this pre-course meeting. We'll kind of start by going over a couple course, like field day specific logistics, and then we'll do a review of the pre-course material, and hopefully we can wrap this up in a little over an hour or so. Here we go. So some important pre-course reminders here. Make sure you fill out your waiver before the field session. I just dropped the waiver link and I can drop it again, and I'll put the waiver link in at the end of the call as well, just because sometimes with people coming in from the waiting room, they don't see the links in the chat box. This waiver link is also the same one that's going to be in your email. And we ask that you fill that out ahead of time, just so we can better keep track of who has their waivers filled out. We do bring like a QR code for the waiver to the field days if someone forgets to fill it out, but we want those filled out before we go in the field. So just the waiver reminder. And then as far as gear list, the gear list is linked into the pre-course email. What's really important is for our courses this weekend, Bridger's lifts are going to be spinning. Oh, does someone have a question? Bridger's lifts are going to be spinning, and to be able to load the lifts at Bridger Bowl, you need to have either brakes or leashes on your skis. They don't seem to care very much about for snowboards, but Bridger requires that you have retention device, especially on skis without brakes. So you will not be allowed to get on the lift if you don't have leashes. We'll have some extra P-cord just in case someone forgets to have leashes on skis without brakes, but please plan to bring some kind of retention device to get on the lift at Bridger. And I think it's important to remind people that you do not need touring gear to participate in the course. We'll split up the groups based on mode of travel. So we'll try to group all of the boot packers together. And we also try to group people based on the other people they signed up for the course with, so family and friends. So when you arrive at the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck on the morning of your course, we'll be splitting people up into smaller groups, because on any given day we have a lot of students. So the course tomorrow, we have about, I think, 16 students. On Saturday we have over 20, and on Sunday we have about 30. So we'll split people up into smaller groups. So yeah, we'll be meeting on the Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck, 9 a.m. And as far as the expectations for the course, we're going to be riding up to the Alpine lift zone if that is open. Where Bridger said they were going to try to open as many lifts as they can, but tomorrow is their first day of the operating season. So if we can get up to the top of Alpine, we'll be exiting the ski area boundary, and the course will take place outside of the ski area. If Alpine lift isn't open, we'll just be going to the top of Sunnyside lift and traversing over, and our field site will be the Alpine lift zone. So that's kind of what the course looks like. There's a little bit of uncertainty because we're not exactly sure what's going to be open for Bridger's first few days here, but expect to be moving around and standing and be outside until 3 p.m. And we'll be meeting, all of our groups will be going back down to the base area to Jim Bridger Lodge Sun Deck by 3 p.m. So in the morning in the course, we'll go over a lot of the forecast, trip planning, and talking about the ingredients of an avalanche. And then in the afternoon, we'll cover avalanche rescue and give everyone the opportunity to practice rescue. And that's kind of the progression of the course. So does anyone have questions specific to the field day? Awesome. And if you do have a question that pops up at any point during the call, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll get to it. And if you have a question that didn't get answered by this meeting, you can always send us an email just at the Friends of GNFAC Gmail. Oh, this is a great question. So once we go up, right up the lifts, we only have one ride tickets. And once we go up the lifts, we're going to stay in the field zone. So whether that is outside of the ski area or the alpine lift area, and we are not going back down to the base area. So we are out on the mountain from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. and you should show up at 9 a.m., boots on, ready to go. Yeah, so those are great questions. So for example, if you're in the field day tomorrow, it is Bridger's first day open. I would not expect to get on the lift for the first half an hour of the morning, and we'll just do kind of intros and beacon checks and kind of fill a little bit of time just because it's the first day Bridger's open. And oftentimes there's a lot of people who want to get on the lift, but we're not competing with like a big powder day, so it shouldn't be too chaotic. I recommend that people give themselves extra time to get up to Bridger this weekend, just because it is opening weekend. So there could be some traffic, parking could be a little bit more difficult. So just give yourself some extra time and plan to be like ready to go skiing or riding at 9 a.m. when you meet us on the sun deck. Great questions. Any other questions about the field day right now? Well, I think we'll dive right on in. So the purpose of this pre-course meeting is to give students the opportunity to ask questions, and it also serves as an opportunity to review the pre-course material. We used to run these courses as large lectures, and that gave students the opportunity to ask questions. Since we switched it to a virtual format, we like to have these meetings as an opportunity for students to bring their questions before the field day. But as always, like, you can show up to your field day with lots of questions if you don't get the opportunity to ask them tonight. So we're just going to do short recaps of all of the video content, and we'll just dive on in so that we can stick to the time limit. So we started off this series with talking about kind of like a big picture overview of the course and why we talk about avalanche risk management. And the reality is most people who are victims of avalanches either triggered the avalanche or someone in their party did. And what that means for us is that we have a lot of choices and learning that can help reduce risk for ourselves. And we started the course off by really talking about the nature of avalanche hazard. And then we finished the course by talking about risk management and rescue and what happens when things go wrong. So when we think about the big picture with what avalanche hazard is, we want students to understand that there are different types of avalanches and that the mechanisms for these avalanches and the setups for these different types of avalanches are different. The most dangerous type of avalanche for us as skiers and riders is going to be a dry slab avalanche, because the way those avalanches break, they can break with a lot of mass, they can break wide across slopes, they can break uphill of us when we're skiing or riding. They can just be really dangerous for us, but we don't want to discount loose snow avalanches just because they're a little bit smaller. And wet snow avalanches are just not as common of an avalanche type that people interact with, because when wet slab avalanches are on the table, usually the skiing is pretty bad. Like, you have pretty saturated snow, but wet slab avalanches can be really dangerous for things like roads or infrastructure. But it's not something that you see people getting caught in as frequently as dry slab avalanches. So the majority of this course, the majority of this course really focuses on what causes dry slab avalanches. And so we'll be mostly talking about dry slab formation. We kind of started off with this idea of the avalanche triangle where you need to have all of these different factors to create avalanches, and terrain is kind of the foundation of the avalanche hazard, because without having terrain capable of producing avalanches, you don't have an avalanche problem. Ella made these awesome infographics that show we want to define avalanche terrain as places where avalanches start, run, and stop. So the start zone is those commonly steeper slopes, and the track and the run out or the debris field of an avalanche could be lower angle, but is underneath the start zone. So we have a lot of different factors that go into characterizing avalanche terrain. And this is the primary list. So you can have the slope angle, slope size, aspect, and elevation. And then we can use visual indicators like vegetation to determine extent of an avalanche path. And then the slope shape, kind of like the slope shape and slope size, can really help define the consequences of terrain. And we also talked about terrain traps. And the goal with the field day tomorrow is that we get to be hands-on with identifying avalanche terrain and identifying some of these characteristics so that we can have a better understanding of the capability of avalanche terrain. The most foundational component of this is like avalanches don't happen without steep enough slopes. So those start zones, statistically, most start zones are between 30 and 45 degrees. And the majority of start zones for dry slab avalanches are in the upper 30 degrees. Doesn't mean you can't see an avalanche on a less steep slope. It's just really uncommon. And it frequently involves wet snow when they're on really low slope angles. And you don't see as many avalanches on steeper slopes because you don't have a layered snowpack building on really steep slopes. So slope angle is kind of like the baseline for defining where avalanches can start. So like I was saying, these upper 30-degree slopes, these are the places that avalanches are most likely to be starting. And our definition of avalanche terrain is beyond just those steep slopes, because it's the terrain that's connected to those steep slopes. So in this picture, you can see the visual indicators in the trees and vegetation, where you have different patterns of vegetation and different types of trees. And we want students to think about the big picture with avalanche terrain. It's like, how can you identify if a slope is steep enough to slide or could be impacted by an avalanche? Slope angle is one way, vegetative clues or the history of the area is another way. So we kind of want these overlapping approaches to defining where avalanches can run and where avalanches start. The really big takeaways with terrain is we want students to be able to identify where avalanches can start, run, and stop so that they can make choices to manage their exposure to that. Because if we never expose ourselves to avalanche terrain, we're not taking risk. And so we want people to be really aware of the extent of avalanche terrain, especially if you're on the beginning side of your avalanche education, being really cautious about exposing yourself to avalanche terrain. So the important questions are, can the terrain produce an avalanche? And then the follow-up is, what happens if there's an avalanche here? And then what we want to work towards is like, okay, how do we control or mitigate the exposure to those consequences? Those are the really big questions with terrain. Does anyone have any questions about the avalanche terrain section before we move into weather and snowpack? Okay, guess we'll dive on in. So with weather and snowpack, weather is the architect of our snowpack. And when we can identify those weather factors that create a different layers of snowpack, that can be helpful for building our bigger picture. And really big picture, our weather is what's creating a layered snowpack, and our red flags or indicators of potentially unstable snow, 3 of them are from weather. And so if we can learn how to read weather resources, you can really be able to know a lot about or know what to expect about the snow on the ground and how it's going to be layered. So we're just going to talk about a really basic weather overview. And then, Paul, I see your question and we'll just get to it right after the weather segment. So with our major weather factors, more snow equals more avalanches. And what we want to know about the snowfall, and what Erica's video that I have a couple slides about hinted at with the snowpack, is even within a snowfall event, we can have different types of snow, different densities of snow, different moisture content in snow, and that can determine how the snow interacts, how those layers interact with each other and bond with each other. And that can be a really big architect for avalanches. So with snowfall, what we want to be thinking about is how much did it snow and how much did it snow in water, total water amounts? Because here in Montana, we can have big snow events that the snow is really light and doesn't actually weigh very much. And so when we think about layered snowpacks, we will see avalanches when we have a big load or a big weight or a lot of water. And so weight is an important factor. And most avalanches are happening during or immediately after a big storm. Another really big factor, especially here in Montana, is wind. So in this picture, you can see evidence of the wind direction with the cornice on the top of the ridge. So the wind is blowing over that ridge and depositing snow in the form of a cornice or wind pillows. So we have cornices, we have some cross loading where the wind is going across the slope. You can see the textured snow surface. That's like an indicator that snow is being transported across the surface. And when we think about how to build cohesive slabs of snow, wind is really good at building cohesive slabs of snow because it takes those snow grains and packs them tightly together. So wind is a really big factor, and it's essentially like anytime we see wind actively transporting snow, we can call that a red flag and assume that wind slabs are forming. So the final big red flag with our weather factors is temperature, especially above freezing temperature changes, because rapid warming causes the snow grains to have liquid water in them. And once we get liquid water on the surface of the snow doesn't want to stick to itself. So that's actually more of a problem with loose avalanching. But once we get a lot of water in the snowpack, it really destabilizes the snowpack. So that's kind of almost a different factor than these dry slab avalanches. But we want to be heads up if we have warm temperatures or a drastic shift of temperature in a storm. So the big takeaways from Zach's weather talk were what we can do to learn about the weather, like pulling a weather forecast before we go out. Most avalanche forecasts just have shortened mountain weather forecasts, and they may not be accurate for every single place within a range. They're kind of like big range scale forecasts, and being able to pull weather resources that are more specific to where we're going is really useful. And then when we're out there, being able to identify these red flags that we're talking about and understand what they're doing to the structure of the snowpack, and being able to stay alert to changing conditions or destabilizing weather conditions. So that's kind of the big picture with weather. And does anyone have any questions about weather? And I'll get to your question, Paul, about terrain. So Paul's question in the chat, in one of the videos, an instructor said, if you can skin through trees, an avalanche can run through them. So I think it's a pretty common myth that treed terrain doesn't avalanche. And that's just it's not accurate. So if you have really dense forest, like trees that are packed super tightly together, you can have a little bit of anchoring of a snowpack where you may not be able to have a continuous structured snowpack. Like it's disrupting the slabs and the weak layers by having so many trees, but that's going to be such dense forest that you couldn't ski or ride through it. I've seen avalanches run through like pretty dense forest before. And so just because there's denser trees doesn't mean that you can't have avalanches on that slope. It just might be not as common to see avalanches. Because I think we use these vegetative clues to determine where slide paths are. And one of them is like having no trees or small trees because avalanches keep hitting the trees. But once you get into more old growth, big trees, those trees are really hard to rip out. Like you have to have huge avalanches to rip trees out. And so just because there are trees on a slope doesn't mean it's not avalanche terrain. We want to default to like, what's the slope angle? And if all things were, if you had two slopes and everything else was equal and it was avalanche terrain, you'd still be less likely to have an avalanche on a more treed slope. But the consequence if you did have an avalanche would be more severe because what's going to happen if you're knocked off your feet into a bunch of big trees? So that's kind of the picture with trees and avalanche terrain. I don't know if that answered your question. You can always just unmute yourself and chime in here, Paul, if you want. Okay. I think we'll keep moving along then. So the next segment that Erica did was about mountain snowpack. And with this picture, you can see the really visually obvious different layers of snowpack that different weather events have created over the season. When we think about the big picture with what we need to have a slab avalanche, we need to have cohesive snow or a slab and a weak layer that's going to be less cohesive. And what we mean by cohesive is like that snow that wants to stick to itself, like, you know, good snowball making snow or wind packed snow that can create blocks versus snow that doesn't stick to itself as well and doesn't stick to the other snow around it as well. And right now, because we have so little snow on the ground, which is this is pretty standard in December in Southwest Montana, we do actually have pretty obvious weak layers. So in the field section, you will see kind of drastically different slab versus weak layer snow, which is pretty cool to be able to see. So we need to have slab over weak layer on a steep enough slope. And then the kind of thing that tips it one way or the other is, do we have enough load to cause the slab to fail on the weak layer and then slide down the hill? Because that's really what these slab avalanches are. So that trigger could be a skier or rider, but it could also be an increased snow load, say from a storm or a big wind event. So kind of the trigger with the one thing, the plug I'll make for these wet avalanches we're talking a little bit about is generally the trigger is actually the liquid water that's causing the snowpack to weaken even further. It's not like it's causing it to weigh more. It's just weakening those underlying snow bonds. So you have snow that's getting weaker because there's liquid water and it's getting more primed to slide down the hill. But yeah, Erica lined it out really well. These different storms create different layers within the snowpack. The snow falls from the sky in different forms of snowflakes. There's a bunch of different types of snowflakes. Like it's not quite like every single one is unique, you know, like you all hear. But you have so many different types of snowflakes, and the bonds that those snowflakes form with each other when they go onto the ground is different based on the temperature or the pressure or the wind. So lots of differences. You have a really layered snowpack. And the big picture, like because the scope of this course, we're not going to be able to get like really nitty gritty with the snow science. But you need to know that layers of snow change over time. They eventually, all become water. So they eventually compress and melt and freeze until they finally melt fully. But like this time of year in Southwest Montana, our layers of snow are actually growing because of a process called faceting. And the snowflakes didn't fall out of the sky as big grains, but they grow over time because of the shallow snowpack and cold temperatures. And so we have these weak layers, persistent weak layers that grow over the beginning of our season and then can stick with us, or layers that can become larger on the surface of the snow and then get buried. And those are our persistent weak layers. And we'll have a couple good examples of those in the field just because of the conditions we've had recently. But the really important part of this equation is just being able to go out and recognize when you have hard snow or slab with soft snow under it. And it really doesn't take, being a scientist to see that. You can just see it in a pit wall, or our avalanche forecasts are going to tell us if forecasters are going out and seeing this hard snow over soft snow or slab over weak layer. And then the recipe for generally good stability is going to be hard snow all the way to the ground and then softer snow on top of that. So like in some parts of our forecast region right now, we have low avalanche hazard. And that's either because we don't have enough hard snow over the soft snow, or in many locations, we still have relatively hard snow with softer snow on top of it. So we just don't quite have the whole recipe for an avalanche in parts of our forecast region. Over the course of the season, that will change. So that's kind of the big picture. The other thing that Erica's video talked about that I think is really important is understanding that different avalanche problem types have different characteristics, and we can change our patterns according to those characteristics. And those problem types are what the forecasts are using to talk about the avalanche hazard. Not all avalanches are created equal. Like the consequences, say in this picture of Saddle Peak, the consequences of this really large avalanche that's a persistent slab avalanche are going to be really different than, say, if you had a relatively small loose avalanche or storm slab avalanche. So those are two really different types of avalanches. And for recreationalists, being able to identify the different characteristics and understand the different nature of these avalanche problems is really important. So yeah, just reiterating again that not all slab avalanches are created equal, and being able to recognize the difference in character and how to recognize these types of avalanches or these conditions as they're building when you see them, and be able to use that to make decisions about how you're going to travel. Like for, I guess a really good example would be like last year, we had really unstable snowpack once we got enough snow on top of it. And we had these persistent slab and deep persistent slab avalanches that were breaking really wide across slopes and were being remotely triggered. So triggered not from a steep slope, but a shallower slope that was connected to a steep slope. And so when you have conditions like that, you want to give steep slopes even more space and give avalanche paths more room when you think you could trigger an avalanche from a flat slope far away. And that's very different than, say, the conditions we have currently in our advisory region, where you couldn't remote trigger an avalanche in most places. So those are just really two very different sets of conditions. And we want people to recognize that. So to kind of wrap up the snowpack discussion, at like the level of this course, what we really want people to understand is how to identify a layered snowpack when they're out in the field, and then how to use the tools within an avalanche forecast to help them make decisions about how they're traveling. Okay, before we move on to the second half, does anyone have any questions? Just a plug that you're also welcome to, like, I think you can raise your hand in this call and I can unmute you if you can't unmute yourself. Oops, went forward in my slideshow. Okay, I think we'll move on, and if a question pops up or someone's typing one, we can get to it. Okay, so we've talked about our avalanche triangle and the components of terrain, weather, and snowpack and how they create avalanches. But I think the reason most people take avalanche courses is because they want to be able to travel safely in the mountains. And you need to understand within this risk equation that I showed in the first slide, you need to be able to understand the hazard, but you also need to have like kind of actionable space for making decisions that impacts the amount of risk that you're taking ultimately. And we can control or make choices that help influence our exposure or vulnerability. And the kind of bottom line is if we're recreating in the mountains and we're choosing to be in avalanche terrain, that's where avalanches happen. And there's only so much we can do to really limit our exposure and vulnerability if we're making the choice to be interacting with avalanche terrain. And I think that's why we end up seeing accidents, even from well-educated and well-prepared recreationalists. And I used an accident that I was involved in as kind of a case study that even people who have a lot of experience in training can, if they're traveling in avalanche terrain, it's, somewhat only a matter of time before you make pretty critical mistakes. And often those mistakes, when we look back at accidents, are linked to the human factor or a way that humans make decisions that doesn't always reflect like the reality of the snow on the slope or the nature of the terrain. So we just want to be able to recognize these human biases and the patterns and shortcuts to be able to kind of protect ourselves from those a little bit. So here's the whole list again. And I think what we really want people to recognize is that there are factors that we can influence that do cause accidents. Like we at the Avalanche Center deal with avalanche fatalities pretty much every year. Last year in the advisory region, we didn't have any fatalities, which was kind of incredible. But we see these patterns year in, year out. And we hope to be able to teach people some ways to break these patterns. So the pattern of lack of preparedness, this one seems like it's really easy to overcome, but it's not as simple as just making sure you have the avalanche rescue gear. It's like making sure you have the training to know how to respond and that you're prepared to respond if you're engaging in avalanche terrain. I think a place we often see, I guess, mistakes made is when we ask groups after accidents what their plan was. Oftentimes there isn't a great plan going into a day. So we want to be really proactive. Another area that kind of relates back to that planning concept is people who aren't aware of either the avalanche hazard, or the severity of the hazard. On the simple end of that spectrum, it's like checking an avalanche forecast or like looking for those obvious signs of instability. But ultimately, you see people who are underestimating the consequences of if an avalanche happens on a slope. And that can be a hard thing to teach people. Oftentimes, until people like see an avalanche, it just doesn't really like register to them what the consequences of that could be, especially when our desire is to go ski the slope or go summit the mountain. So it can be often really contradictory to what our own desire is. The kind of final set of factors just really revolve around what we talked about with the terrain discussion, is like not being able to recognize avalanche terrain and move through it in a way that protects your group from bad consequences. So we'll talk about it a bit in a few slides, but in Southwest Montana, we have a problem where there are accidents involving multiple people on a slope. Recently, like the last handful of years, there's been some really high profile accidents in the United States involving people traveling uphill, so skinning and being caught in avalanches. And the hope would be that after taking a course like this, you can understand what types of conditions or days it's not appropriate to be skinning uphill with a group in avalanche terrain. Because the consequence if you're wrong and the slope avalanches when a bunch of people are on the slope is really high. So that's just overestimating some, your own ability to deal with the hazard there. And yeah, we definitely like have a problem with that specific type of behavior in the US and in Southwest Montana. And I think part of it has to do with our human experience is pretty short compared to like the lifetime of an avalanche path. And oftentimes in 10 or 20 years of recreational touring experience, you may not see a slide path run to its maximum, because that could be on a 100-year cycle or longer time scale cycle. And so we need to operate as if we're not sure what the extent of that slide path run could be, especially on increased hazard days. So knowing what we know about what causes accidents and the kind of key factors we see in accidents, the best practice is using processes to manage risk for yourself. And the Avalanche Canada's daily process kind of creates like a cyclical process that you build on every day of your season. So you're trying to check off the before the trip, during the trip, after the trip, again and again and again. So what that looks like for us before we go, checking the forecast, having a good plan, and having a good gear check. So what we're getting from these avalanche forecasts, we are pulling from a GNFAC or another forecast if you all are just visiting or recreate in other places. The avalanche forecast can look different based on the advisory region. Ours is a much more narrative form forecast, so you do have to read through the area you're trying to get the information about, and you may have to click on hyperlinks to get even more information. So what we want to know is, what's the weather doing? What's the history of the weather? What's the avalanche problem? How does the weather change the avalanche problem? So predicting into the future. So like on this forecast on my screen, we have in the Bridger range, we have a breakdown between considerable and high hazard. And so those avalanche danger ratings have a lot of language written into them. And when you go on a GNFAC avalanche forecast, you can click those links and read more about what those hazard ratings mean. And there's also always going to be, I'll go back, there's always going to be information about the nature of the avalanche hazard or the avalanche problem. In the GNFAC forecast, you have to go into the trip planning pages to have it be broken down by region. And those trip planning pages do list the avalanche problems. It's not always listed on the main page, but there'll usually be some type of language about like what the nature of the avalanche problem is, and then observations that are useful. Okay, so we've checked an avalanche forecast. We know what the weather's like for the day. We really want to just develop a plan based on the best information that we have. My headphones keep falling out of my ears. have a good plan for the day, and that's going to be based on the forecast that we read, the general snow conditions, and then also our group and our group's ability. So like my plan for the day may not even be based on the actual avalanche hazard. Like if there's really bad breakable crust and the skiing is not very good, but I still want to get out, I may plan my day um, to reduce skiing on the breakable crust if I can, or changing my aspect based on the snow conditions. Or if I'm going out for a day and myself or my group is really tired, I'm going to try to adjust my plan for the day based on those factors. So it's not just solely the weather factors. Oftentimes it is like the group factors, or snow conditions or weather conditions factors. So lots of different factors go into having a good plan for the day. And I think the most important bit that we can't really teach you in a single field day is about navigation and being able to plan a trip and actually be able to move through the terrain. And that just can take years of learning to understand how to do well. And I think the goal of this course would be that you can walk away um, having a good enough sense of how to gauge where avalanche terrain is and where it isn't, so that if you want to avoid avalanche terrain, to have a day with less risk, you can do that. We'll get lots of good practice measuring slopes with inclinometers and looking at avalanche paths. And this map actually shows the Bradley's Meadow area up at Bridger. So that'll be the zone that we're going into. And you can see that there is some steeper slopes just based on the slope angle shading of this map. So yeah. And then the final step in the pre-trip is having the right gear. So we can't carry everything with us, but we want to have the essentials. So at a minimum, the beacon shovel probe, and then whatever you would need to survive the weather conditions. And in Southwest Montana, sometimes that can feel like carrying a lot of stuff because the weather can be pretty bad here. It can be pretty cold during the winter. So with our avalanche rescue gear, what we really want to have our students carrying is a modern digital 3 antenna beacon, a probe that's functioning, and a metal shovel, ideally with a like extendable handle. Those shovels are nice for digging with. Most beacons on the market, actually all beacons on the market, are going to fit those criteria. And we really recommend, like with rescue gear, it's not the place to like save money. These are like life-saving pieces of equipment. You can buy used if you trust the person you're buying it from, but generally we recommend like this stuff gets bought new. Oh, question just popped up that was relevant to this picture. So I'm just going to go back to it. So Stephanie asks, using a tool like Onyx shows the slope angle, but as it gets snow loaded, can the angle change relative to the ground? And that's a really good question. And I'll kind of proceed answering it with, so what these slope angle shadings are based off of is the digital elevation model. And so you have basically all these pixels that this model is built off of. And oftentimes the pixel amount, I think the standard pixel amount is something like 10 meters by 10 meters. So 30 feet by 30 feet grids. And so you can often not pick up on small scale terrain variations with this digital elevation model. And so it shouldn't be seen as an absolute truth for how steep a slope is. It's really just a model based on the geographic data that this map contains. So when you're out in the field, you need to be using your common sense and using what you're seeing to determine how steep a slope actually is. And you don't want to be kind of nitpicking off of like a single degree or 2 degrees, because these models can be wrong by several degrees of error. And it's also been shown that humans' evaluation of a slope with an inclinometer is wrong by several degrees of error. So we want to have like a buffer built in too, where we can just recognize the general steepness of a slope. That's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. Okay, we were talking about avalanche rescue gear. And then the bottom line with rescue gear is that everyone needs to be carrying the pieces of gear and know how to use them, and just keeping in mind like what's the worst that could happen. You're not always going to be able to carry, like this picture is a search and rescue group. You're not always going to be carrying like a 60-liter backpack with you. You're not going to have everything that you could possibly want, but you should at a minimum be prepared to deal with the reality of going out for a tour that someone's equipment could break and you might have to boot pack out, or you know, someone could get injured skiing into a tree and you might need to be able to wait it out and wait for search and rescue to come get you. And our local search and rescue team is an awesome resource, but they can't get to you right away. And so we want to encourage people to be prepared for a couple hours, or potentially prepared if you're in a really remote area. You might be spending a night out, and just being prepared to do that. I know over the years, like I always want to take stuff out of my backpack or go a little lighter, and I just like can't bring myself to leave some things behind, so I end up carrying a bigger backpack. But yeah, we just want to make sure people are prepared. And with our gear, Alexis was talking about just having a system. I usually just run through a checklist of like making sure I have what I need. I used to have a coworker who would have a checklist on his dashboard of all of his equipment he wanted to carry with him. And he would just run through it every morning when we got into the car. So just make sure you have a system and that you communicate with your partners and you have a plan. And yeah, best practice is going to be checking our gear at the trailhead. And that can be as simple as doing a trailhead beacon check, which we'll show you how to do in the field course, and verbalizing, I have beacon shovel probe, I have a first aid kit, I'm carrying an inReach, like as simple as that. But yeah, like I end up hearing from people that, oh, it just like takes a little bit of time to do the beacon checks. And it's like, well, the devices aren't going to be able to help you or your group member if they don't all work. So it's worth taking the time to make sure they're all functioning. Okay, that was our before you go. Does anyone have questions related to that part of our kind of risk management process here? Okay, no other questions. Now we'll go into every day out. So because this is only a single day field course, like we're not going to be able to teach you everything that there is to know. And what we really can emphasize in our courses is good travel habits. And I already talked about this a little bit with Stephanie's question about slope angle shading. And what we really want to do is be able to recognize avalanche terrain and recognize that while we're navigating, we're making a bunch of different decisions over time, and that we want to build in the reality that we might be wrong with some of our decisions, and we want to have a margin for error. And sometimes what that can look like is, you're out for a day, say you're going to Beehive Basin, and you're following a skin track, and all of a sudden you realize that your skin track is going up a steeper slope. And it's like, oh, I didn't mean to go on a steep slope today, and this looks like avalanche terrain. And being able to be like, well, this wasn't part of my plan for the day, and even though I'm like already on this slope, I can make a decision to turn around and reroute my skin track or avoid this steep slope, and be able to actively make those decisions. Because the safest travel practices would be avoiding steep slopes going uphill, even if somebody else has already made another decision. We don't really know, like, you're never going to know the reason somebody made a decision, and they could have just been following somebody else and not been like actively thinking about how steep the terrain they were in was. So yeah, just this concept of um, making choices that reduce risk actively in your terrain choices. Um, and the reality is, like, while we're traveling, uh, sorry, while we're skiing or riding downhill, we're a little bit less vulnerable to an avalanche than while we're going uphill, because we can be moving faster, or it's easier to be one at a time on a slope. So yeah, those safe travel practices, and it's really emphasizing, like, in in reality, like, it's one thing to say we're going to be moving one at a time on this steep slope, but in reality, it's like, can you see each other? Can you hear each other? Are you able to quickly respond if something goes wrong? And like, these are all really important questions to be asking yourself as you're traveling. And yeah, this is that statistic I was citing earlier. The reality for all the major accidents in the last 10 years in our advisory region, more than 50% of them involve multiple people. So I think in reality, these safe travel practices are really hard to follow. And our kind of recommendation would be starting small. So starting simple with simple terrain choices, easy to see sight lines, lower angle slopes, and getting better at making travel and movement decisions before you progress into more complex terrain. And yeah, we can't teach you all these good habits, and we can't like be over your shoulder telling you what to do every single day, but you can use these basic principles to guide how you're moving. Any questions on these, like the travel habits in particular? I think it's a really important topic that doesn't always get enough emphasis because it's hard to teach people about. Oops, jumped ahead. Oh gosh, let me go back a couple. Okay, next we'll talk about red flags. Um, and yeah, these red flags, like, we just want to be able to recognize unstable conditions when we see them. We've already talked about a few of them. But the two we haven't talked about is the number one red flag for unstable conditions is recent avalanches. So if you're planning on traveling on similar aspect elevation and slope angle as a slope that's already had an avalanche on it recently, that's a pretty good indicator that that snow is unstable. So when you see cracking, collapsing, or wumping, that's really just the collapse of the snowpack onto a weak layer without a steep enough slope to avalanche. So this is an avalanche without a steep enough slope. Those other factors we already talked about, the weather factors, were a lot of recent snow, any amount of rain. Once we get liquid water in the snow, it often destabilizes the snowpack. And we're talking about, heavy snowfall, so an inch an hour for over 6 hours, or 12 inches over 24 hours, equivalent of 1 inch of snow water. So this week on, oh gosh, what day was it? Monday into Tuesday, it snowed pretty heavily in the highlight, in the northern Gallatins in the highlight area, and it snowed about an inch of water in 24 hours. So like, we'll often see avalanches after that much snow. And then yeah, that windblown snow, and this is something we see pretty much every day in the mountains here. It's almost abnormal when you don't see some kind of wind transported snow, but oftentimes, at least with the windblown snow, or like the rapidly thawing snow, that can be really aspect dependent. So it can be dependent on where the wind is scouring and depositing, and then for thawing, it's like, where's the sun hitting the slope? Usually on those solar aspects, so south and southeast, south. southwest, depending on the time of year. And you're seeing less solar interaction on those north slopes, especially this time of year where like you may be in the shade all day on a north facing slope, so you won't see rapid thawing as commonly. This rapid thawing we're seeing increasingly more with warmer wintertime temperatures. So it's not just a spring phenomena anymore. Like we're seeing above freezing temperatures every month of the year now. We had I think it was last week, we had wet loose avalanches running at Bridger Bowl because it was like 50 degrees after it snowed. So yeah, these red flags are meant to be like simple ways to dial back. Like when you're seeing one of these red flags, that's a sign to dial it back out of avalanche terrain. In addition to the information you have from a forecast, this is like what you're seeing out in the field that can help be good decision-making points. Something we'll talk about in the field course that we didn't really talk about in the video series that much is other snowpack observations. So we'll talk about like simple observations you can make, like pole probing or digging small hand pits. And it will also show you how to dig a pit and do an extended column test. And basically, like we want people to use an avalanche forecast and those signs of instability as the kind of first order data points. And snow observations like digging a snow pit is a great way to learn about the snow structure and to learn more about snow in general. But they're not really, snow pits aren't really meant to be like a singular data point. They're often used like when you dig pits repeatedly over time in an area to determine, is the snow less stable than it was last week? Is it more stable? Forecasters use snow pits as forecasting tools and these stability tests as forecasting tools. They're not really intended to be singular decision-making points. And that's why we don't really talk about them in our risk management talk, but we will show you pits in the field day, mostly because it's something that's really common in GNFAC conditions reports and videos. So kind of just wanted to make that plug about snow pits and snowpack observations in general. Like we're defaulting to these snowpack observations and snow pits when we're not getting information from the environment otherwise, or we don't already have the pieces of the puzzle we need to make decisions. Okay, so that is our kind of during the trip process, or a bit about it. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. Just a quick plug, and then the final thing we'll talk about is avalanche rescue. So to like the way we want to teach people how to manage risk also involves reflection and involves kind of critically engaging in like the decisions you made and how to make better decisions in the future. And we talked about it in the risk management video more, but the avalanche environment is a really low feedback environment. Oftentimes, you can ski a slope on a day where the snowpack isn't stable and you won't get direct feedback. Or, say, depending on the conditions, it may be hard to trigger an avalanche. And so you're not necessarily getting direct feedback about whether or not the decisions you made were good ones. And we don't want people to assume that just because an avalanche didn't happen, that it was because of their own planning or preparation. It might have just been pure luck. And the reality is, like, there are thousands of people out recreating in avalanche terrain, not triggering avalanches. And most of the time, you're just not going to get that feedback from the environment. We call it a wicked learning environment, where oftentimes you won't know that a slope is unstable, or you won't have signs of instability until the avalanche has been triggered. So we just want people to know that and really especially with the type of snowpack we have here in Southwest Montana, where we have often deeply buried persistent weak layers that aren't always obviously unstable, that it can, you could put 100 people on a slope and it's just the one person finding the right spot on a slope that could trigger the avalanche. So we want to always think about managing risk with that in mind, that we're not going to know everything. It's not possible to know what the snowpack is like on every square meter of a slope. And our goal is always to be able to go ride another day and enjoy another day out. And so we want to impress on you that you need to make conservative decisions that still help you, accomplish what you want to accomplish. So that's kind of the risk management plug that we want to teach in this course. Okay, the last bit before we're done for tonight is just talking about avalanche rescue. So we talk about rescue last because we hope that you can manage risk in a way to avoid having to perform an avalanche rescue. But ultimately, if you're going out in the mountains and traveling in steep terrain, you need to understand how to perform a rescue. So when we look at the user groups caught and killed in avalanches, this is just the last 10 years data. It's not just snowmobilers who are getting caught and killed in avalanches in Montana. We have a lot of skiers getting caught in avalanches as well. Generally, the survival rate for avalanche victims has gotten better because we have better rescue equipment and better trained people going out skiing and riding, which is good news. Our survival rates drastically decrease after the first 15 minutes of burial. And I guess something to keep in mind that this chart, is a mix of data from the US and Canada. And when we look at international data too, it can sometimes be skewed by regions that have better coverage for rescue networks than Montana does. We have great search and rescue teams that are mostly volunteer here in Montana, but the bottom line is, like, a helicopter and a search and rescue team is not getting to you quickly here. So we really need to be more prepared, and we need to expect to enact a companion rescue within our group. So before we talk about what to do if someone else is in an avalanche, if you're caught in an avalanche, the best case scenario is that you try to ski off the slope or get off the slope or self-arrest at the top of the slope and let the avalanche debris go by you. Only the snow on top of you can bury you. So those are kind of your like baseline techniques, is like traversing off a slope if you can, and picking out a relatively, like, a zone that's more like a subridge or lower angle before you go on a slope, like having an exit route, or being able to stop yourself or arrest on a slope. Once you're caught, if you have an airbag, that's the time to deploy it. You're not going to have very much time to think. And really all these steps, I would advocate that, like, avalanches are really chaotic. They happen really quickly. They can be really violent events, and you may not have time to do these steps. The reason we recommend people try to get have their poles out of their hands or kick off their skis is because your poles or your skis can just cause injury to you if they're attached to you. It's a really good argument for having releasable bindings. I know snowboarders right now, snowboards aren't releasable, and it's just another thing attached to your body that can hurt you. You really want to try to swim and stay on top of the debris. That's what airbag packs do. They help lift people up to the top of the debris. And right before you're buried, the recommendation of creating an air pocket is as simple as throwing an arm over your face, or trying to create extra space in front of your airway. And then just know that, once you've been caught in an avalanche, you may not have very much control over what's going on, but hopefully your well-trained partners are coming to get you as soon as possible. Okay, so on the other side of that equation, the stages of our companion rescue, initially it's going to involve, having to make some determinations about the safety of the group that wasn't caught and be able to delegate tasks out. If you're responding by yourself, that's a step that you're going to essentially end up skipping, because you're the only one that's going to be responding to this avalanche. And I think the why we talk about scene safety with avalanches is you're not going to be an effective rescuer if you get caught in an avalanche or injure yourself. And so you want to respond quickly, but if you get hurt, you can't be an effective responder. So you need to take care of your own safety or the rescuer's safety as well. So the search phase gets broken down into a beacon search, probe, pinpoint, and shoveling. So we have that beacon search, pinpoint with a probe, shovel, and then the first aid and evacuation. And that can often be the longest, most challenging part. We really want people to get good at using their rescue gear so that the search component can be as fast as possible, because we don't have very much time. The shoveling is going to be difficult and it's going to be time consuming. And often the first aid and evacuation, even with search and rescue, is going to be difficult and take a long time. So with that signal search, with our beacons are really good at finding other beacons, but our beacons don't have an infinite range. Most beacons, commercial beacons, have a range between 40 meters and 70 meters. And so we want to do a signal search in a pattern where we're going from that last seen point and trying to effectively cover the path. And even this drawing is a bit misleading, because if you see these zones that don't have any debris, like the person is not there. Gravity dictates that they've gone downhill from their point last seen, and they're going to be, if they're fully buried and you have no visual clues, they're going to be in the debris field. And so you can move quickly to get to that area where they're most likely to be. And you're not always going to be on top of a slope for a rescue either. You might be going from the bottom up. So your search techniques could just be dictated by the situation that you're in. The goal of the signal search is to cover the path effectively and quickly and not miss them. And we use the search strip width of half the range of our beacon. So once we have a signal, it gets easier. We follow the arrows and numbers. It's not going to take us in on a straight line until we're closer to the beacon, as you can see from the kind of, what do you call those? The electromagnetic flux lines. And a beacon's going to be sending those out in 3 dimensions, and your beacon's going to be interpreting them in 3 dimensions. Pretty cool devices these days. Modern beacons make searches much faster than old analog beacons. So we're going in on our course search line, we're following the arrows and numbers. And then when we get close, we slow down because our technique needs to change a little bit. This is the fine search. So with our fine search, we are trying to isolate our variables and only move in one direction at a time while keeping our distance off of the surface of the snow consistent. And we'll show you all this. This is a lot easier to learn in person and practice in person. So we're only moving one direction at a time, either across the slope or up and down the slope, until we get a low value. So when we have our absolute low value and we've confirmed that it's the lowest value, that's when we get our probes out. So probing, we want to start probing at that low value, and then we want to have a strategic pattern if we don't get a probe strike right away. So this pattern shown here is like the cinnamon roll style circle. I'm more of a square person, so I just do a concentric box around my low value. And our spacing on that is about the size of a foot, so 10 inches, about the size of a foot in a ski boot. With shoveling, it's like once we have a positive probe strike, we know it's a buried person. How we know it's a buried person is it's a different height than the other probe attempts, and it feels different. So hitting a buried person is going to feel like there's rebound, like you can't push your probe through it like you could a block of snow or ice. And then it's going to be a different height. So once you have your probe strike, you get your shovel out and you start digging. The goals with digging are getting to somebody's airway, because that's the nature of the emergency you have. They don't have an airway. And then we're creating a workable platform. Right now, unfortunately, we don't have that much snow on the ground, so we actually don't have very good snow for practicing digging. Later in the year, if you find a plow pile, like at a trailhead, that's really good digging practice. And avalanche debris can often be pretty firm, like a plow pile. And yeah, the kind of plug with avalanches, and we talked about it already, is like an avalanche can become an emergency really quickly. And like our goal with this course is to prepare you to have the tools to help you deal with an emergency, but ultimately it's going to be up to you to practice. So we can introduce you the techniques and coach you on technique. And ultimately it's going to be up to you to practice to get good at those techniques, especially with rescue. And the goal of the field day in whole is to just give you an opportunity to learn in the field and practice with our instructors. All right, that's the recap. I know I went a little over the hour, but if y'all have any other questions, now's the time. And if you have any questions that you don't want to ask over the call, you can always shoot an email to friends of GNFAC, especially if it's about the course logistics. Otherwise, you can bring your questions to the field day and your instructors can answer them. The question that just popped up was in the gear video, the instructor said minimum recommended probe length. So basically manufacturers aren't selling probes that are under 240 centimeters. Probes are also not the kind of thing to skimp on and go ultralight with. Average burial depth in North America is a meter. So any probe that you're buying in a store in a gear shop is going to be adequate. Generally, like probes are the kind of thing that break pretty easily, like if you're actually using them and practicing with them. So like for example, I do rescue practice a lot and work in the field frequently, and I pretty much get a new probe every year or every other year. So that minimum probe length, it's just going to be 240 centimeters. Most professionals use at minimum 300 centimeters, and those are just like commercially available probes. Well, cool. If there aren't other questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes if people do have questions. But otherwise, we'll plan to see you all at your field day. And reach out if you do have questions specifically about the field day that you didn't ask during this talk. But the call is more or less over, unless you want to stick around for a question.